Shannon entered the entrance hall to the mansion with a tottering gait. A mixture of exhalation and uncertainty gave her a feeling that she certainly couldn't easily describe. It swelled up in her chest until it felt like she was about to burst. After stopping for a second in front of a servant room to take a deep breath and calm her heart, she opened the door. Inside, Goda, who'd been ordered to take the midnight shift at the mansion tonight, was absorbed in a worn-out crossword puzzle magazine. He looked up for an instant to see if one of the family had come in, but when he realized it was a fellow servant, he returned to his puzzle as if nothing had happened.
源氏様より郷田さんのお手伝いにつくように言われてまいりました。
ああ、そうですか。それは助かります。そろそろ戸締まりの見回りに行きたかったのですが、ここを開けてもいいものか困っていたのです。何しろ旦那様方の会合はまだだいぶ続きそうですからね。いつ何時お茶のご用命があるかもわかりませんし。
そうですよね。ではどうしましょうか。私が留守番を。
ではシャノンさん、申し訳ありませんが、お屋敷内の見回りをお願いします。私はここで親族の皆さんのご用命の待機をしておりますので。
はい。
Shannon was slightly disgusted. Even though she'd come to help out as a favor, she was casually being forced to do the job of a person actually on duty. Furthermore, after one-sidedly forcing that task on her, Goda returned to his magazine once again and became immersed in its crossword puzzle. Shannon bowed her head as a token sign of respect for her elder and left to patrol the mansion. Thanks to her being a bit ticked off, she managed to suppress that floaty feeling she'd been having just until now. And anyway, she couldn't let Genji or Canon see her like this. She wanted a little time to herself until her heart calmed down, so maybe going on patrol wouldn't be so bad. She began to hear the tumultuous voices of a family discussion coming from the dining hall. Someone was speaking at great length, only to be interrupted by someone else. This second person also began to speak in a very long, drawn-out fashion until yet another person interrupted. That kept on repeating. It was as though their displeasure was seeping out through their voices. She had been told to go to the guest house, so it would be bad if Kraus discovered her. Thinking this, Shannon dashed past the dining hall. Then she went along a prearranged route for the dark mansion, checking that all the locks were secure. She walked down the hall, checking each window. There were no humans on Rokkenjima other than those connected to the family, so locking up didn't really serve much of a purpose. No one had been in the habit of locking up at the Ushimaya head family, at least not until Natsui had scolded them for being so careless. The metal fixtures on the windows were ice cold, and as she checked them one by one, the glow of her heart seemed to cool down. At that time, she thought she saw something twinkling across the hall. Twinkling? How could anything be twinkling through the darkness of a hall? She figured it must have been her imagination, but she still held her breath. Grasping a curtain, she fearfully gazed out the hall. However, other than the occasional crack of thunder brightening the hallway, she was unable to glimpse any flicker again. It must have been her imagination after all. Maybe her heart was so agitated that she'd seen something that didn't actually exist. Shannon went back to checking the windows. However, a certain unnerving memory was resurrected in the back of her mind. It was that ghost story, which had been passed down amongst the servants that served in the Ushimaya head family. The mansion had two different masters, one of the day and one of the night. Beatrice, master of the night, would sometimes fly around the mansion in the forms of sparkling butterflies. That was the story. Come to think of it, didn't once say he'd seen it with his own eyes. Though he got sulky when I said he must have imagined it and refused to believe him. Could it possibly be true? The roar of thunder gave no answer. And then Natsui and Maria, 17 and 18. That's an achievement, 24 hours. Day 2. So we should have 8 bodies. Second day, October 5th, 1986. Genji tightened his bow tie and looked outside through the crack in the curtains. Maybe the rain had died down a tiny bit since the previous night, but the thick rain clouds didn't seem to be letting any trace of the morning sun get by. The morning was dim and far from refreshing.
やはり今日いっぱいはやみそうにないか。
お待たせしました、源氏様。
Canon finished checking his appearance and exited the washroom. On their normal schedule, it was rare for anyone to have supper going straight from a midnight shift to an early morning shift. However, they had on a special schedule for 2 days of the family conference. However, unless the typhoon passed today, the relatives' stay on this island would last until tomorrow. Canon thought it would best to prepare for a special schedule to last an extra day. The two of them left the guest house, opening their umbrellas. The rose garden had been devastated by the wind and rain on the previous night. Even though they'd spent several days making it beautiful to welcome the guests, one stormy night was enough to ruin it. Canon sighed. The two headed for a mansion. They were supposed to meet up with Goda and prepare breakfast. Goda was a perfectionist but had probably woken up and was probably already preparing breakfast as exquisite as elegant glasswork. So in other words, Goda is dead. They reached the overhang by the entrance to the mansion and folded up their umbrellas. Genji took a bundle of several keys from his pocket and unlocked the front door. The Ushiyomara family was the only thing in Rokkenshima, though in the past they hadn't been a habit of locking up. However, Natsui had ordered that the mansion be locked up from midnight to early morning. Ever since then, unlocking the door in the early morning had been part of the servants' morning shift. The task had been given to Genji and Canon so that Goda could start preparing breakfast as soon as he woke up. Silence had fallen in the mansion, giving the impression that the mansion itself was still asleep.
では、朝の仕事を始めよう。
はい。
The two of them split up and began opening the curtains throughout the mansion. If the curtains stayed closed, the mansion would be enveloped in faint darkness, as though it was still trapped in the previous night. Following the well-rehearsed procedure, Canon went around the mansion, opening the curtains for the window after the other without having to retrace his steps once. Even though, with this horrible weather, drawing the curtains made it feel a little bit like morning. While doing that, he passed in front of the kitchen. Even though he hadn't smelled anything yet, his stomach started aching for some Goda's prized cooking.
おはようございます。
He tried to greet Goda, who had still been getting breakfast ready, but Goda was nowhere to be seen. The kitchen was darkly lit, and not only were curtains not open, but the fan wasn't even running. It was still cold without any trace of fire being lit, so of course there were no signs of breakfast being made either. It was thought to be inexcusable. Perhaps Goda had overslept. Even servants are only human. They sometimes sleep and showed up late. In rare case such a thing happened, it's part of the servant's code to hide the unsightly scene before anyone notices, smoothly cover it up, and make sure the family never even realizes that anything has gone wrong. Canon took the receiver from the phone that had been fitted to the wall and dialed the number for the extension line in the servant's sleeping room. He couldn't hear the characteristic sound of the dial tone. Canon tried picking up the receiver again, but even so he couldn't hear the usual dial tone. He tried dialing again, but it had no apparent effect. Could the lightning last night have damaged some machine, breaking the extension line? The equipment in the mansion was all worn out. Cannon fully understood that even the smallest thing could have caused it to break down. He gave up trying to wake Godo with a phone and dashed to the servant's sleeping room. How long has it been since I stopped sleeping and started lazily staring up at the ceiling? That vague sense of awakening was part of Natsui's usual morning experience, so she is alive, okay. She always slept lightly and couldn't sleep at all without medicine. So Natsui's sleep was definitely not a happy thing. When she looked outside, she saw it was still pouring. If she hadn't sensed a tiny amount of light, she would have mistakenly thought it was still the previous night. She herself was one of the hosts, so she mustn't wake up later than her guests. Urging herself on, she raised up her body, which still hadn't completely recovered from yesterday's weariness. No one would torment her as long as she remained inside this room. Okay. And her headache would get worse. Okay, I'm gonna quickly make a prediction on who's dead. One moment. So Kraus, Jessica, and Godo, I'm saying. Kinzo, maybe not, I don't know. Hideyoshi, Rudolph. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6, probably Kiri. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Kumasawa. And either Nanjo or Shannon for the last one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No one would torment her as long as she remained inside this room, and her headache wouldn't get any worse. This room was the only place where she could find peace, so she left it in its returning to the world where her husband and siblings kept trying to stab each other in the back. In that case, wouldn't it be better to just stay locked up in this room forever? That ridiculous notion brought a bitter smile to Natsui's face. She started to sound like Kinzo. Though she often complained about Kinzo staying locked up in his room on his own, and refusing to attend to everyone else, the truth was that she longed to do the same. Natsui gave her head a small shake. Her fantasy was replaced by the reawakening of her usual headache. When she reached the doorknob trying to leave the room, her hand touched the scorpion charm she had hung there from before going to sleep the previous night. It was Maria's charm, which Natsui had received from Jessica. Didn't Jessica say something about having the power to repel magic, telling her to hang it on her doorknob? Maybe it's thanks to the charm that at least this room would be protected from the malice of her husband's siblings. As she thought this, her mood began to get a little more cheerful.
ジェシカのおかげで少しはゆっくり眠れたということかしら。
Then Natsui remembered. That's right, last night I promised Jessica that I'd give her a charm of my own exchange for this one, didn't I? Natsui opened the drawer of her dressing room and took out an antique case that she had treasured when she was a child. Inside it were many small objects that Natsui would have thought were valuable at the time. From amidst those she pulled out a red pouch. Inside was a small round mirror around 10 centimeters across. It looked quite old, but the design on the back of the mirror was very ornate, and it felt something of historical value. At the very least it seemed much more authentic than the other charm, which looked like a plastic scorpion keychain. She had heard that it was a spiritual mirror for warding off evil spirits, and she'd been given it specifically by her grandmother when her grandfather's mementos had been distributed. It had been believed since long ago that a strange power resided in this mirror. Perhaps people thought it could reflect the calamity and malice in the same way it reflected light. Natsui returned the mirror to its pouch. It would probably be a fitting object to hand over to Jessica. Just as she placed it in her pocket, the sound of someone knocking the door suddenly echoed through the room.
はい。
おはようございます、奥様。早朝から申し訳ございません。
今行きます。何事ですか？
No servant had ever come to her this early in the morning, nor had they come to wake her in person. Perhaps something bad had happened. Oh, yeah, something bad has happened. Maybe some fatal oversight had been made while preparing breakfast, something that would shame the household in front of their guests. Natsui took a deep breath in anticipation for whatever trouble she was about to hear of. When she opened the door, Genji once again gave a morning greeting and bowed while bowing deeply. Natsui tentatively responded.
おはようございます。何かありましたか？
申し訳ございません。昨夜の落雷で電話機器に故障が出たようです。内線電話が不通になっておりますもので、直接のお伺いになってしまったことをお許しください。
内線電話が普通？それは面倒になりましたね。修理は可能ですか？
残念ながら故障箇所がわかりません。後で業者を呼んで修理させたいと思います。
ということは、この台風が過ぎるまでは修理不能ということですか？つまり、客人たちの滞在中はずっと普通ということですね。客人たちのお世話に支障は？
出ないよう最善を尽くします。
結構です。粗相のないようよろしく頼みます。
Natsui let out a small sigh of relief. She had been prepared for the worst, but the damage to the telephones wasn't the kind of trouble she was worried about. Then again, this would be probably enough to spark sarcasm from either. Natsui gave her head a light shake.
朝食の準備は順調ですか？
それがゴーダの姿が見えません。朝食の支度もまだ行われておらず。
なんですって？
Natsui was indignant. To her, this was a much bigger problem with her phones not working. And despite that, the piece of information was part had been postponed. Why did everything go well most of the time, and when she came down to something like this when the relatives were visiting? Natsui put her hand on her forehead and shook her head.
大方朝寝坊でもしているのでしょう。とにかく誰でもいいから急いで朝食の準備を。
Natsui exited the hall and turned around for a second to close the door to her room. The creepy thing she saw there was silenced her completely. It was an unpleasant sight, as though someone had dipped their fingers in a reddish-black liquid and scratched the door around the doorknob. So the charms did save her. It was probably some sort of awful prank, arranged by someone who wanted to make it look like they'd tried to force the door with bloody hands. But nobody except Jessica and Natsui knew the charm was exchanged. Except Beatrice, of course, but... Please silence the background, of course.
これは悪趣味な。
私も今ここにお伺いして初めて気づきました。後ほど清掃いたします。
大方、趣味の悪い客人の冗談でしょう。不愉快です。実に不愉快です。
Who in the world would put such a childish and disgusting prank? Natsui had a pretty good idea, but of course there was no proof, so even if she pressed with this show, it would seem like she was just making a fuss about nothing. In fact, it would surely be better to act as though she hadn't realized that such a prank had been played on her. Natsui gave the order to have it cleaned and headed off to the parlor with a squeak on her heels. Okay, so Hideyoshi is alive, so I was wrong about him. Maybe Nanjo and Shannon are dead in that case. When Natsui and Genji arrived at the parley, Iba and Hideyoshi were already there. Of course, Kinzo could also be dead, but I don't really want to count him. Because he's an easy one to say is
おは
dead.
ようございます、皆さん。
おはよう夏日さん。朝食も合田さんが作るっちゅう話やないか。朝から胃袋が大喜びで騒ぎっぱなしなんや。
本家の楽しみは食事くらいがせいぜいですものね。
エヴァさんも朝からご機嫌がよろしいようで何よりです。
With a wary expression, Natsui recognized Iva's gaze, which was fiercely competitive despite the early hour. Then Canon jogged in. After bowing an apology to relatives for running inside the mansion, he noticed Genji and told him something in a small voice.
カノン、ゴーダはまだ見つからないのですか？
申し訳ございません、奥様。お屋敷内もゲストハウスも回ったのですが、まだ。
一体どこへ行ったというのです。とりあえず今はゴーダより朝食の準備が先決です。至急対応しなさい。
はい。
Canon glanced at Genji. It seemed he had something else to report, but was uncertain whether or not the word should come from him. Genji nodded and decided to give the report himself.
奥様、ゴーダだけではありません。旦那様の姿もありません。
So, Weishbach Kraus, that's one.
主人
Technically two, because also Goda.
はい。奥様より先に旦那様に朝食の準備がないことをご報告しようと思い、それから旦那様だけではありません。ルドルフ様ご夫妻と
Rudolph,
ロ
Kirin.
ーザ様のお姿もありません。
Did I get Rosa? I didn't get Rosa, so I was wrong about Rosa, wrong about Hideyoshi, that's two.
ゲストハウスにも屋敷にもですか？
はい。ゲストハウスの部屋にもおられません。
When she heard that Goda was missing, she assumed he slept in or was loafing around somewhere. However, now that she had learned that several of the other relatives were also nowhere to be seen, she began to take a slightly more optimistic view. Last night's family conference had continued all night, up until the present moment. If so, they might have wanted to cool their heads right after being shut in a stuffy room, going out for walks on their own through the rain. The part of cooling their heads really sounded like something Kraus would say. Goda had probably been summoned to accompany them and aid them in some way. Goda was not a man who lost track of time. He had to understand that the preparations of breakfast would have hindered him if he did not return. However, maybe the family conference had continued until this very moment, with an atmosphere that would make it hard for anyone to slip out. Yes, that theory would be quite convincing for Natsui. She remembered the illusions she'd felt that morning, as though the previous night had never ended. When she learned that the feeling wasn't just an illusion, she once again took a deep wary breath. After all, the banquet of filthy vultures circling Kinzo's property was still going on.
大方、庭園のどこか、あるいは海岸の方で相も変わらず遺産の話を繰り返しているのでしょう。とにかく、ゴーダを呼び戻さなくては、いつまでも朝食の準備が整いません。
ってことはなんや。兄さんたちの話し合いはまだ続いとるんか。
She had planned to say it in a small voice, but Hideyoshi overheard Natsui and managed to grasp the situation.
兄さんもルドルフもタフね。ローザの場合は若さかしら。私たち夕べの24時過ぎにはもう眠くてベッドに戻らせてもらったんだけど、確かにあの時点でもまだ兄さんたちは熱論を交わしてたわ。男って熱くなると嫌ね。
Natsui snorted, her face still blank.
カノン、表を探してらっしゃい。ゴーダを見つけたらすぐに戻って朝食の準備をするよう伝えなさい。
かしこまりました。
夏日姉さん、表とは限らないわよ。お父様の書斎ってことはないかしら。
なるほど。考えられん話やないで。どういう話の流れかはわからんが、お父さんの主催に場所を移して、お父さんにも混じってもらって議論を続けてるっちゅう可能性は十分あるやろ。
そのような汚らわしい話題を好んで、お父様が書斎へ招き入れることなど考えられません。
あらそう。じゃあ仕方ないわね。源氏さんとカノン君は申し訳ないけど、外を探してきてちょうだい。確かに兄さんなら、頭を冷やすために外を散歩しようなんて言い出しても不思議はないわ。たとえこんな天気でもね。私はお父様の書斎に行ってくるわ。ひょっとするとそこにいるかもしれないしね。
客人であるエヴァさんにそこまでのご足労はおかけできません。私が行ってきます。朝のご挨拶も兼ねて。
あら、じゃあお願いするわね。でも朝の挨拶を交わしてくれるかは疑わしいわね。夏日姉さんってお父様とは仲よろしかったかしら？
仲が良いかは分かりかねますが、後宮家の跡継ぎの妻を許されるだけの信頼を得ていると確信しています。
ならきっと返事くらいはしてくれるわね。お父様とは朝食くらいご一緒したいの。ぜひ降りてきてくださるよう説得してくれないかしら？私たちはすっかり嫌われちゃってるみたいだけど、そこまで信頼を得ている夏日姉さんの言うことなら聞いてくれそうですもの。そこまで短歌を切ってお父様を説得できず、一人で降りてきちゃったりしたら、信頼を得ているなんて二度と言えないかもね。
自信はありませんが、努力はします。
Natsui responded, looking discouraged. However, knowing Kinzo's temperament, she had absolutely no confidence in her ability to bring him out. Eva was clearly mocking her, confident that Natsui wouldn't be able to get Kinzo to come down. Even so, Natsui would lose face if she gave up, saying it was impossible and letting Eva go instead. Eva's mean-spirited and unreasonable demand made Natsui clench her fist slightly. While Genji realized this, he spoke softly to her over her shoulder.
奥様、よろしければこれをお持ちください。
それは？
Genji handed Natsui a sparkling gold key of ornate design. It was a key to Kinzo's study. The study had an auto lock and couldn't be unlocked as long as Kinzo forbade entrance. However, since Genji was especially trusted by Kinzo, he was allowed to carry a key to that door.
でもこの鍵を使ったら、あなたも咎めを受けるのではありませんか？
親方様は深くお休みになられている時、扉を叩く。それに親方様にお部屋を出ていただくよう説得するには、ぜひお使いください。
源氏。
Until now, Natsui had thought of Genji as a cold servant who wouldn't do anything for her, since he worked directly under Kinzo. But it looked like she would have to alter her understanding of him. She wanted to communicate her gratitude, but by then Genji had already turned his back to her and was walking down the corridor with Kanon. But as Natsui watched him go, the words directed at her from behind were sneering.
じゃあお父様を必ず連れてきてね。息子のかわいい嫁の言うことですもの。きっと聞いてくれるわよ。私たちは客人だから、ここでのんびりくつろがせてもらうわ。
You know, I knew you wouldn't die, but boy do I wish it was you.
予算かえば口が過ぎるで。すまんが夏日姉さん、お父さんのことよろしく頼むわ。
Without answering, Natsui forcibly spun around on her heels and left that place. After all that excitement the previous night, there was no way anyone was going to wake up early. George, Jessica and I were, okay, so Jessica is alive, were snoring loudly on beds of the cousin's room, but Maria had gone straight to bed without joining us and was completely awake. As she rubbed her sleepy eyes and looked around, she was met with a loud snoring of the three other cousins. Okay, so let's check again. So if we assume that everyone we've seen, who haven't we seen yet? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we've got Kinzo. We've got one survivor of the people we haven't seen so far. As she rubbed her sleepy hands and looked around, she was met with the loud snoring of the other three cousins. For a while, Maria had to think about what had happened. After that, she realized that her mother wasn't with her, and she quickly got lonely. Maria left the cousin's room, trying to head to the room that had been arranged for her and her mother. Paying no heed to the other who were sleeping soundly, she slammed the door shut. In response, Battler mumbled and rolled over in his sleep, but it wasn't enough to wake him. After a while, Maria returned once again, opening the door with a lively bang. When she left the room, her face had been sleepy, but now that she was back, she looked irritated. After that, she climbed onto Battler's bed, which had happened to be the closest, and he started yelling and jumping on it like it was a trampoline. After making sure I was awake, Maria looked over to George's bed and started jumping on that too. In that manner, the three of us were greeted with an extremely pleasant awakening.
ありがとう、マリアちゃん。僕たちは夕べが遅かったから寝坊しちゃったのを起こしてくれたんだね。でも、もう少しだけ起こし方を優しくしてくれると完璧だったかな。
ジョージ兄さんは本当に大人だよ。尊敬するぜ。
もうすぐ7時なんだな。ま、確かにもう起きてもいい頃だぜ。
ローザおばさんが部屋にいなかったの？もう起きてお屋敷の方に行っちゃったのかな。
Maria kept groaning ooh and looking unhappy. She didn't exactly seem lonely because her mother wasn't around. It was more like she was irritated and thrown off balance because her mother wasn't where she'd expected. If we could just tell her where her mother was, that alone would probably calm her down, but unfortunately we had no way of knowing where Aunt Rosa was except that she wasn't here.
どうせ朝食に行くことになるんだし、屋敷の方に行こうぜ。
そうだな。マリア、一緒に屋敷へ行こうぜ。きっとローザおばさんもそこさ。
ママはお屋敷なら行く。
そうだね。お屋敷に行こうか。多分親たちはもう向こうに行ってるんだよ。
Maria regained her usual composure so completely her earlier tantrum seemed like a lie. We got dressed, left the room, and headed for the mansion. Once more there was a knocking sound on the study door, but there was no answer. He seemed to be still sleeping, and I could not wake him. If she went back downstairs and said something like that, Eva would probably be amused and triumphant. Even putting either aside, it was problematic that Kinzo had stayed shut away this entire once-a-year conference, not even coming down to greet anyone. Even the family head, no, especially the family head, couldn't fail to make an appearance. I wonder if I can convince him myself. Netsui read it herself and used the key she'd borrowed from Genji to open the door. Why, the first thing I'm thinking is I want to see a dead body. Even though she was prepared for a sweet stench, which seemed to eat one's brain as it poured out the small crack of the door, she couldn't help but grimace. Thinking that he might still be sleeping, Netsui entered the room quietly. Oh, he's alive, so... Everyone we haven't seen yet is dead. When she did, Kinzo was already awake and looking down at the window.
お目覚めでしたか。おはようございます。
どうやって入ったのか。
Kinzo spoke with his back still facing her. His voice was not harsh but calm, and Natsui was slightly reassured. However, though he's awake, he wouldn't have ignored all the knocking if he was in a good mood. Natsui wasn't able to relax.
申し訳ございませんでした。源氏さんにお願いして、書斎の鍵をお借りさせていただきました。
ほう、源氏がか。我が友がそれに足ると思ったならば、話を聞かぬわけにもいくまい。して、私に何言おうか。
はい。もうじき朝食の準備が整いますが、ぜひお父様にもおいでいただきたく思いまして。
朝食はここでとる。いつものように運ばせるがいい。
しかしお父様、年に一度の親族会議です。せめてお顔をお見せになってください。
下に降りて、私の死後、遺産をどのように食いちぎるのかを決める議論に加われというのか。バカらしい。そのような話は私を抜きで好きに進めるがいい。そしてそれが親族会議だというなら、私がこの部屋を出るほどの価値はない。私は忙しいのだ。構うでない。
His last word carried the threat that any further questions would not be appreciated. Natsui realized that adding any further pleas would finally bring his wrath down upon her. She didn't look forward to facing either sarcasm, but there was nothing more Natsui could do.
そうですか。わかりました。みんな残念がるでしょうが、そう伝えます。
Natsui decided to give up. Bowing silently, she tried to leave the room before Kinzo's spasmodic temper could flare up. As she did, Kinzo spoke to her. His voice was so calm and gentle it felt like it came from an entirely different person.
夏日、後ろ宮の家に嫁ぎ、もう随分になるな。
はい。後ろ宮を名乗ることを許されてから、もう随分になります。
前の家が恋しくなることもあるか。
いいえ、嫁ぐとは成果を捨てることです。私は後宮夏日。帰る家も懐かしむ家も、すべてはこの後宮の家のみです。
She truly wasn't exaggerating. Such was the resolve which she felt whenever she applied the Ushimaya family name to herself. And that's precisely why she was so saddened when her husband didn't treat her like an Ushimaya, leaving her to race about in vain.
クラウスな女で、お前がその夫であったなら、いや、それは言うまい。
それはどういう意味ですか、お父様。
Natsui was shocked. If Kinzo's words just now were what they seemed, it wouldn't have been more enough to make up for all she'd suffered up to that point.
忘れよ。年寄りのざれ言だ。
Kinzo once again faced away from her. He told her to forget it, but Natsui couldn't help feeling a warmth in her heart.
お父様、この夏日は血はつながらずともお父様の娘です。後宮家の名誉も栄光も、そしてお父様が残されたものもすべて、この夏日が必ずや守ってみせますから。
お前に片翼のわしをまとう資格はない。しかしお前の心には確かに片翼のわしが刻まれている。ならばお前は間違いなく我が血族で後宮家の栄光を引き継ぐものだ。お前の衣服にわしがないことを嘲笑う者もいよう。しかしそれに耳を貸すことはない。心にわしを持つ者だけが真の私の血族なのだ。お前を後宮家に迎えられたことを今は光栄に思っている。
Without saying anything more, Kinzo remained with his back to Natsui. However, Natsui couldn't help but feel something warm well up inside her that she hadn't felt since long ago when she had been just a child. Natsui bowed slightly and left left the room.
あら、ちょうどいいタイミングだったわね。お父様の様子はどう？あんまり遅いから様子を見に来ちゃったのよ。
When Natsui left for study, she saw Eva climbing the stairs and their eyes met. Eva was smirking unpleasantly, thinking that Natsui would leave begrudgingly after failing to convince Kinzo. However, the way Natsui was now, such a frivolous laugh would not have disturbed her. She was not permitted to wear the family crest on her clothing, but she was permitted to wear it on her heart. She spoke calmly and clearly and confidently, with the dignity of one who would protect the Ushiromaya family's glory.
お父様は親族会議にはおいでにならないそうです。汚らわしい議題に関心はないと仰せです。
とかなんとか言っちゃって。お父様を説得できなかったんなら素直にそう言えばいいじゃない。
哀れですね。お父様が嘆かれるお気持ちも分かろうというものです。
それはどういう意味よ。
Natsui did not answer. Just as Kinzo had done earlier, she showed Eva her back as she headed down the stairs. Eva finally realized that she was being made fun of, and something that had happened too quickly to bolster Natsui's confidence. Even so, she apparently didn't have the courage to risk Kinzo's wrath. Unable to even knock on the door, she could only click her tongue, make a motion as though scratching at it, and follow after Natsui.
それで兄さんたちはいたの？お父様に聞いたの？
聞きそびれましたが、書斎の中にはいませんでした。お父様が夫たちの下船な話のために入室を許すこともありえませんから、行き先を知ることもないでしょう。下に降りて使用人たちが探してくれるのを待ちましょう。朝食は遅れますが、お茶でもいかがです、エヴァさん。
別に結構よ。
Eva couldn't hide her confusion at the complete difference in Natsui's attitude. She was acting so boldly, and while Eva hated to admit it, she even had a sense of dignity about her. Unable to find her fault with anything, Eva could only follow Natsui back to the parlour. When the two of them returned to the parlour, Hideyoshi had been joined by the 4 children and Nanjo. Okay, so Nanjo is alive. That leaves Kraus, Rudolph, Kiri, Rosa, Shannon, Goda, and Kumasawa are dead. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Wait, 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Is it 6 who died on the first night? I don't remember.
主人たちはまだ見つからないのですか？
You
はい。申し訳ございません。あと、熊沢が
Okay.
朝食の準備に入りました。
it's 6 who die on the first night, so
もう少し時間をいただきたいとのことです。
the clock read a little past 8. 8 should be the time to start breakfast. Normally going over that time would be a disgrace to the host.
今、カノンが表を探しています。それから、シャノンの姿も見えません。
シャノンまで？まったく、主人は何人を従えて散歩に出かけたのですか？
Just how many people had gone missing now? The number was large, it was still... Now the number was this large, it was starting to feel truly unpleasant, as though the people here were the only ones being left out of something interesting. At least it seemed to reflect the feelings of the children, and Mario in particular. She was indignant, her stomach growling, almost as though her mother and the others had left to go off alone to eat something delicious without her. The other children were flipping through the channels on the television, trying to find a program that might interest Maria and cheer her up. Nadia was sitting on the sofa, gazing blissfully at the children while reading a book. It must have been a book about chess. The sound of footsteps came rushing towards them with a pitter-patter. There was only one set, so they realized it before seeing who it probably belonged to Canon, not Kraus and the rest.
奥様、失礼します。
その様子では見つけられなかったようですね。
申し訳ございません。まだ。
もう十分です。ご苦労をかけました。
Didn't know where they were, but they had to be somewhere on this island. They hadn't had a thing to eat since the previous night, so their stomachs must have been growling about now. He'd probably come plodding back of their own accord before long. By now, Natsui was feeling exasperated, starting to feel that the only reason for them to go out of their way and search.
私はお客様方にお茶のご用意をしに厨房へ行きます。二人とも早朝からご苦労様でした。
Natsui left the parlour, acting as though the release of tension had caused a new surge in her headache. Canon tried to call her back, but Natsui left swiftly.
どうした？まだ何かあるのか？
はい。旦那様方のお姿を見つけることはできませんでしたが、その...
Canon sounded evasive. It looked as though he didn't know where they were, but had spotted something that might connect it to their disappearance. Even when Hideyoshi noticed this exchange in words and came over, they probably picked up on something strange in Canon's behavior.
どうしたんや、カノン君。クラウス兄さんたちは見つかったんか？
実は、バラ庭園の倉庫の様子がおかしいのです。
様子がおかしいというのはどういう意味だ？
それが、何と説明すればいいのか。
Canon hesitated once more. His tone wasn't one you'd expect from the usually fearless boy. Seeing this, even Hideyoshi looked at each other dubiously.
どういうこと？倉庫の中に兄さんたちがいたんじゃないの？
いえ、中はこれから調べます。その鍵を取りに戻ったところなのですが、
ようわからんが、とにかく中を調べればいいだけの話じゃないか。その倉庫の鍵はどこにあるんや？
使用人室にあります。すぐに中を確かめましょう。
Canon dashed off to the servant's room and returned with the key. Genji left the parlour, saying he would go check, but then Ivu and Hideyoshi followed after him. What was this something strange about the storehouse that had caused the usually fearless Canon to hesitate? It was still pouring outside, but perhaps their curiosity over something that Canon couldn't talk out won out. While the children made a big fuss watching television, Canon and the rest dashed over to the entrance. The Rose Garden storehouse was a place that housed various tools used to manage a garden. It was definitely not a pretty building. because of its appearance being built so that it was hidden in the corner of a rose garden. Canon, Genji, Eva and Hideyoshi came cutting across the rose garden holding umbrellas. They entered a small patch just off the rose garden, which was normally off limits for those appreciating the garden and only used by those maintaining it. They dashed through that, and the storehouse came into view in front of them. It was quite an old shed, and compared to the usually flawless, perfect beauty of the rose garden, it was pretty seedy looking. Is it normally unlocked? It was easy to understand why being built in such a hard-to-see place. Even Hideyoshi arrived at the storehouse long after Canon and Genji.
カノン君たちは早いな。わしは心臓が爆発しそうや。
こんなところに倉庫なんか建ててたのね。何よそれ。
When Eva looked at where Canon was pointing, she was at a loss for words. Noticing that Hideyoshi also followed Canon's finger and was likewise too shocked to speak. The entrance to the storehouse was a kind of shutter, and there, everyone suddenly realized why Canon had unable to find a word to describe what they had now saw. On the shutter, which was completely filthy from being exposed to wind and rain for so long, stuck right on it. There was something that looked like a strange dark red liquid? Mucus? Or maybe it was some sticky paint. It's blood. An indescribable and eerie shape was drawn on the shutter with some kind of ghastly substance. Rain caused it had to drip down like fresh blood leaking from an open wound. Not beating around the bush, some kind of mark was drawn there with a ghastly substance that looked like blood. And probably was, in a shape that something that seemed ominous. 2 circles were drawn there, and a side was designed that looked like a cross. 4 ends of the cross were widely exaggerated, and it looked like some sort of crest something in Europe. And the cracks between the shapes were closely packed together. There were some unfamiliar characters or possibly symbols.
なんちゅう悪趣味な落書きや。これ、あれか？悪魔の儀式とかの魔法陣いうやつとちゃうか？
It wasn't surprising that Hideyoshi would say such a ghastly shape, drawn in a deep red, dripping substance.
これいつ書かれたの？
昨日雨が降り出す前にここに来ましたが、その時には何も書かれてませんでした。
他の方々の目に触れる前に何とかしよう。ご覧になられたらご不快になられるだろう。
そうね。ただの倉庫小屋とはいえ、こんな気持ち悪い落書きを1秒たりとも放置したくないわ。
倉庫の中に塗料もあります。応急処置でとりあえず塗り消して、後日天気のいい日に改めて塗装しましょう。
Genji remembered that he just recently seen another scribble, and that it too had been a strange dark red substance of same colour as this. That must have been... That's right, he had seen it on the door to Natsui's room.
カノン君、さっさとこの落書きを消して戻りましょう。たとえ倉庫とはいえ、実家の落書きは本当に腹立たしいわ。
はい、すぐに済ませますので。
Canon squatted on the front door of the shutter and unlocked it. He then lifted it up with all his strength. A boisterous noise resounded, and the eerie shape drawn on the shutter began to suck through the top as the shutter was raised. At least for the time being, that ominous drawing disappeared from the direct gaze, and they all breathed a sigh of relief. Thanks to a kids program they come across, Maria was feeling much better. Batra and Jessica were poking fun at the kids' show at every turn, cackling together. George was enjoying the program from Maria from her perspective. Nadia sat on the sofa by himself, passing the time by reading quietly. They heard hurried footsteps coming from the hallway. There were footsteps of a single person. Did that mean it wasn't a group of 4 that just left? It was Genji. It was very rare for Genji, who considered being out of breath a violation of the servant's virtues, to be gasping for air. He'd probably come dashing back from outside the mansion. His shoulders were soaking wet and he didn't have his usual trim appearance. Genji noticed Nanjo looking at him, gave a small and silent bow and quickly approached him.
南條先生、申し訳ございません。至急お越しください。何事ですかな。
Genji whispered something in Nanjo's ear. Nanjo went pale. They rose from the sofa, trying not to be noticed by the children who were engrossed by the TV, and the two of them rapidly left the parlour, muffling their footsteps. Just as they were about to exit the parlour, they came across Natsui pushing a servant cart loaded with a tea set. Genji whispered something in Natsui's ear, and Natsui went pale too in apparent shock. Then, leaving the servant's cart where they were, the 3 of them dashed towards the entrance. George noticed running down the rose garden through the window.
なんだろう。源氏さんと南條先生と、あれは夏日おばさんかな。
どうしたんだよ、兄貴。
何かあったのかな。ひどい慌てようだったね。
When Jessica and Maria saw Eva, Hideyoshi and Nanjo were no longer in the seats and the servant cart had been abandoned at the entrance of the parlour, they also realized something was the matter.
何か事故でもあったとか？
行ってみようぜ。俺たちだけのけ者なんて面白くねえしな。
For some reason, what Battler said sounded extremely indiscreet, but they couldn't deny that they were a little insecure and concerned after seeing the adults run off in the rain without regard to their appearance.
行ってみようぜ。何があったか気になるぜ。
Jessica's uneasy words spoke for all of them.
おい、マリア。お前も来るか？それとも、テレビを見てるか？
おお。マリアはテレビがいい。おお。
僕たちだけで行こう。マリアちゃん、すぐ戻るからね。テレビを見て待ってるんだよ。
By the time the kids made it outside, the adults were no longer in sight, but Jessica seemed to have a pretty good idea of where they'd gone, judging by the direction they'd been running. Following Jessica, we ran through the rain-soaked rose garden. The wind seemed to suddenly get stronger. The malicious sound of thunder began to ring out like it had been the previous night. It felt like an eerie something had surrounded the island and was trying to stop us moving forward.
ジェシカ、この先には何があるんだ？
確か園芸道具なんかの倉庫があったはずだぜ。
そんなところに一体何があるんだろうね。
Just as Jessica had said, they began to see a storehouse in front of them. They could also see the adults there. The shutter to the storehouse was open and several adults looked as though they'd been searching for something. For some reason, only Natsui was outside the storehouse without even an umbrella. She looked like she was hanging her head and her back was facing them. There was Genji, Nanjiro and Natsui who had just left the mansion. The ones who'd left earlier, Kanon, Eva and Hideyoshi were also there, making a small crowd of people. But there was absolutely no bustle of activity. When Natsui realized the children were approaching, a terrible expression rose to her face and she ran at them with her arms spread wide. But despite that, no. Because of that, the kids saw the scene Natsui was trying to keep away from them. Inside the storehouse with its shutter wide open, a faint fluorescent light shone down, and right there was... Jessica's piercing shriek rang out, but that was just because Jessica's scream was the loudest. The same thing spilled out of Battler and George's mouth as well. Eva spread her arms wide just like Natsui, running at the kids with a bone-chilling expression on her face.
Georgie!
When Natsui spread her arms, I thought she was trying to prevent us from advancing any further. But that wasn't why Eva was spreading her arms right now. She was trying to stop the kid from seeing that terrible sight. It was her mother's heart trying to protect the eyes and the hearts of us children by blocking our view from that terrible scene by at least the width of her arms.
何の冗談だってんだよこりゃあよ
I'd seen this kind of cheap scene all too often. In manga, TV, anime, and movies, you'd see it over and over again. It's just seeing something like this appear in real life that I've seen plenty of times before in some of those more sensual movies, right? That alone shouldn't... But that suit... It's that old bastard, isn't it? I get it. Then that's Uncle Kraus, and that's Kiri-san, aren't those that...
ダメよジェシカ入ってはダメ見てはダメお父さん
死後硬直をほぼ全身に認められる。多分死後6時間以上は経過しとるだろう。
Okay,
3
we're
回
fine.
の状況を見る限り死後に破壊された可能性が高い。いや、めったなことは言えん。私は町医者だ。検視は専門外だ。
ちゅうことは何や、殺しただけじゃ飽き足らず、さらにこんな無体なことをしたん言うんか。悪魔や、悪魔の所業や。
Aunt Natsui caught Jessica in her arms and Aunt Eva caught George. So I was the only one who could approach the entrance to the storehouse. If only there had been someone to catch me too. I wouldn't have needed this horrible evil scene burned into my eyes. No, that's not it. It isn't that there's no one to catch me. The people who should catch me are right there, aren't they? Just as Jessica said, it did look like a storehouse for gardening tools. A lawnmower with extra blades, a grass pickle and a hammer, some carpentry tools such as we saw, piled up potted plants and bags of fertilizer, and treated just the same, corpses of several people had been laid to rest there. No, they'd been tossed in there. I could tell them by their clothes. That old bastard and Kiri-san, Uncle Kraus and Aunt Rosa, beyond that Gota, and... there's still more of them. How many people died? You're fucking kidding me. I can't even count them on one hand. Damn it. I didn't know whether it had been both gardening tools which used something other than their intended purpose could definitely have wielded with a naked brutality, or whether some horrid tool had been brought here specifically for this. Anyway, each of one of the bodies jammed in here had given atrocious makeup. It wasn't makeup, it was more like their faces had been ploughed. Their faces were smashed into forced expressions that normal people couldn't make even after death. I couldn't tell if there were eyes or noses but I could find their mouths just because they were gaping wide, their gums exposed. But their front teeth were missing, and even their cheeks, that should have been covered all of this, were torn up and laid bare. That trendy makeup you always spend too much time on even though your man isn't doing a thing now.
Oyaji! てめえは絶対地獄行きだとは思ってたぜ。でもよ、ここまでじゃねえだろ。ここまでひでえ目に遭わされるほどの悪党じゃなかっただろうがよ。だからキリエさんもさ、こんな男と付き合うのはやめろって言ったんだ。あんたまでそこまでの目に遭わされる理由は何もねえじゃねえかよ。顔がねえ。顔がねえよ。クソクソクソクソ。
バトラさん、これ以上見てはいかん。こんな姿をお父さんもお母さんもあんたに見せたいわけがない。お父さんとお母さんのためにもこれ以上見てはいかん。
死者ってのは 安らかに眠る顔ってやつを拝ませてくれるんじゃねえのかよ。顔がねえんだよ。俺の親父とキリエさんの顔がねえんだよ。どういう顔して死んじまったのか、それすらもわかんねえんだよ。なんだよ俺は。親父たちのことを思い出すときは、このくちゃくちゃの化け物みてえな顔をいつも思い出せたのかよ。そいつは最高だぜ。クソ親父のニヤニヤとした顔を思い出さなくていいんだからよ。最高だぜ、最高だぜ。でもよ、キリエさんの顔くらいはいいだろ。キリエさんは悪党じゃねえ。たまにはムカつくと思ったけどよ、ちょいとかっこいい俺の姉気分だったお人じゃねえかよ。こりゃねえよ、こんなのってねえよ。クロスおじさんなんかまだマシじゃねえか。顔面じゃなくて側面だぜ。少なくとも顔半分は残ってるじゃねえかよ。まだマシだぜ、まだマシだぜ。
Jessica filled her ears with the sound of her own screaming, trying to shut out my reckless words.
よすんだバトラ君、もうよすんだ、もうよすんだ。兄貴兄貴。
Discarding ancient appearance, I felt to my knees clinging to George's waist and sobbing. As though I was crying on behalf of everyone here, representing the feelings of everyone here, I screamed over and over.
お父さん、倒れているのはクラウスおじさん、ルドルフおじさん、キリエおばさんにローザおばさん、ゴーダさんで5人。
いや、6人や。ここにもう一人おる。
The body Hideyoshi was looking down on happened to be hidden among the shadows in the mountain range of objects, in a blind spot to George, who stood by the entrance. So George couldn't tell whose body it was, so George cursed himself. He cursed for the fact that his worst guesses always turned out to be right.
じゃあ、お父さんの足元に倒れているのはシャノンなんだね。
ああ、シャノンちゃんや。
George fell completely silent. He shook his head and his lower lip trembling. Normally, he would have wanted to run to his beloved's body, screaming and crying. However, before rashly rushing forward, he worked to keep his composure and asked his father,
シャノンもクラウスおじさんたちと同じなのかな。
Hideyoshi deeply understood the meaning of those words, so he couldn't give George an immediate answer. Or rather, he felt that silence was the only sincere and loving response that he could give George right now. When George asked if Shannon was the same, he meant to ask it whether her corpse was in the same condition as the others or not. Since Hideyoshi hadn't denied it, it meant her corpse was in the same brutal state.
シャノンを見てもいいかな。
いや、あかん。
どうして？だって もう二度とシャノンの顔を見られないんだよ。その最後の顔、どうして見たらいけないんだよ。
お前が最後にシャノンちゃんに会ったのは昨日か。
うん。
そうか。そのシャノンちゃんは別れ際にお前にどんな顔を見せたんや。
素敵な笑顔だったよ。
After he had handed her the ring, she hesitated even though she must have already made up her mind. She looked bashful and ran away because she was embarrassed to let him see her face looking like that. That's the expression that revived in George's mind.
そうか。ならシャノンちゃんもその笑顔をお前に残したいと願うはずや。
Hideyoshi looked down upon Shannon's body lying at his feet. Just like the other bodies, it was in such a horrifying state that it'd make anyone want to cover their eyes. Her head had been smashed in from the side, and no more than half of her expression remained. If the remaining blood-soaked half of her expression had been wiped clean, would that graceful smile of hers have peeked out? But only half of it. Without thinking, Hideyoshi slapped his hands over his eyes. How brutal. If her face was going to be crushed anyway, then it only had to be crushed. Might have been able to temporarily distract George from his pain by making the pathetic suggestion that it was someone wearing Shannon's clothes. But half of her face had been left untouched. Hang on a second. So it's not Kraus and Shannon are definitely dead. However, the others have been smashed in half, I think. It's smashed fully. So we could have a body swap on our hands. It caused the body so much humiliation, while still proving beyond doubt that the body was Shannon's and no one else's. How inhuman, how brutish. And there, trying his best to burn the remaining half of Shannon's expression into his eyes as she lay at Hideyoshi's feet, was Canon. Canon was not crying. Tears had risen to his eyes, but they did not drip down. But that didn't mean he wasn't feeling as much sadness as everyone else. Losing Shannon, who he had lived with him in the same orphanage, whom he had loved as a sister, must be just the same as losing a blood relative.
ジョージ、シャノンちゃんはきっとありがとう言ってるぞ。お前に恥ずかしいところを見られとうなかったんや。きっとお前が耐えてくれたこと感謝しとるで。
わかってる。わかってるよ、父さん。わかってるよ。
George leaned against the outside wall of the storehouse, crouching down limply.
父さん、頼みがあるんだ。
なんや。
僕の代わりに見てほしいんだ。シャノンは指に指輪をつけてるかな。
指輪？ちょいと見てみる。
Hideyoshi crouched down. As he did, Canon silently pointed to one of Shannon's hands.
ああ、あるで。これはダイヤの指輪や。クズダイヤとちゃう。なかなかの値打ちもんや。
それはどっちの手のどの指にあるのかな。
と、左手の薬指や。そっか。シャノンちゃん、婚約しとったんか。
ジョージ、あなた、まさか。
エヴァ、今はそんなん関係ないで。シャノンちゃんは男に将来を約束されとったんや。一生を幸せにしちゃると男に言わせたんや。それが誰かは問題とちゃうで。男にそこまで言わしめて、女の本懐やないか。いつこの指輪をもらったんかは知らん。誰が渡したかも知らん。だが、 それでもシャノンちゃんは指輪をもらえたんや。そしてそれを受け入れ、左の薬指に通したんや。指輪を送った男もきっと喜んだんとちゃうか。
To most of the people here, Hideyoshi was simply disturbed by this extraordinary situation with blurting out nonsense. However, someone who knew George and Shannon's true relationship would understand the full meaning of those words.
そっか。ありがとう、父さん。
George stood up. The traces of tears still leaked from his face, but his expression had returned to its usual calm one.
行こう。バトラ君、ジェシカちゃん。これ以上、僕たちがここにいると、大人の邪魔になる。
そうだな。
Jessica sniffed once, showing her face to her mother, who had been holding her this entire time, to let her know she was okay now. When she faced George again, she once again had her usual expression, although she still couldn't smile.
バトラー、しっかり。
Battler kept on crouching in front of his parents' bodies.
すまねえな。がっつり泣いたら落ち着いたぜ。親父の野郎。普段はクソクソ言ってるくせに。ちょっと死んじまったくらいでピーピー泣くんじゃねえぜって。笑ってやがれ。仕方ねえだろ。親が死んだら泣くように。遺伝子すり込まれちまってったからよ。
Battler's face was still bright red from the tears, but at least he recovered enough to fake a smile, if only a bitter one.
カノン、お前もこれ以上ここにいてはいけません。子供たちを連れてお屋敷に戻っていなさい。
Natsui had been standing under the rain this entire time, unable to step into the storehouse. Maybe she had her own way of grieving, different from Battler's. Realizing that she had taken the role of responsibility now that her husband was dead, she gave Canon those orders.
はい、奥様。
Canon rose silently and turned to face me. His face was pure white, almost though his own heart had died along with Shannon, and there was no life in his expression. On an ordinary day, if he had been told to guide the children through the beautiful rose garden, Canon might have led the way. But now there was no distinction between Canon and the children. They were just kids around the same age, suffering pain of losing those close to them. After making sure that the children were leaving Natsui, he started giving orders to Genji.
ケンジ、すぐに警察に連絡しなさい。台風が通り過ぎるまでは来られないでしょうが、どうすればいいか指示を与えてくれるはずです。
わかりました。防災用の無線機がありますので、それで連絡します。
When she heard about Natsui, remembered. That's right, the phones were out today, weren't they? However, they had a radio since they couldn't necessarily rely on phones all the time while living on an isolated island. At any rate, they should start by contacting the police and receiving their instructions. Everything else could wait.
ナチョ先生、もうこの場はどうしようもありませんか。
残念ながら私には何もできませんな。
わかりました。ゲンジ、せめて主人たちの顔を何かで覆ってやることはできませんか。このような姿を晒すことは当人にとっても屈辱的でしょうから。
はい。
The problem with the body swap theory is, where did the spare body come from? Genji picked up several dried up towels from inside the storehouse, and when Eva stopped him with a shrill voice.
ちょっとちょっと、お待ちなさいよ。ここは犯行現場なんでしょ。なら変に手を加えちゃダメよ。私たちは混乱してて現場に土足で踏み入っちゃったけど、それはきっと警察の捜査の邪魔になったわよ。
Natsui glared at Eva, offended. Objectively speaking, Eva was right. Even so, she glared at Eva as though accusing her of refusing to do these tragic corpses would be humiliated even after death the simple kindness of covering their faces. However, Eva had spoken both calmly and correctly. This horrible situation definitely wasn't an accident. It was a crime. Someone had killed them. It was a murder case, so they needed to be careful not to avoid disturbing the site any further. They had to do what little they could to aid the police, preserving the clues that might help them catch the detestable culprit.
私もエヴァさんに賛成ですな。警察が来るまでここは手をつけずにしておくべきです。
奥様、いかがなさいますか？
そうですね。わかりました。ここを閉ざしなさい。それから念のためここに別の施錠をするように。
別の施錠？
ええ、ここに来た時シャッターの鍵は閉じていました。ということはシャッターの鍵を使い犯人が施錠したということです。
確かに通りや。じゃあここを開けた限り犯人の指紋が残ってるんとちゃうんか。
警察に証拠として提出する価値はあるでしょうけど、カノン君が普通に持ってここを開けるのに使用しちゃったわ。多分カノン君の指紋も付着しちゃってるわ。そしてその鍵はさっき源氏さんに手渡され、源氏さんも素手で受け取ってる。大した証拠にはなりそうにないわね。
それは不用心でした。申し訳ございません。
源氏さん、この倉庫の鍵は他にもあるんか？
いいえ、この一つだけです。
ということは犯人はその鍵を使用人室から持ち出し、そして律儀に元の場所に戻したちゅうことになるな。
They wanted the bodies to be found. Ryoshi's theory sounded plausible, but it was actually very strange if you thought about it. Why'd they go over all the trouble of turning the key they stole? Now, if you think about it more deeply, there are some points that are even more bizarre. Yeah, give me a second. So, if they really wanted the bodies to be found, wouldn't it be better to just leave the key in a very obvious place? When a criminal hides a body, it's usually trying to delay the point that it should be found so that they can use that time to escape. The six weren't necessarily killed here, but it was reasonable to assume that they were killed somewhere on this island, carried to the storehouse and hidden to delay the discovery of the crime. And yet the eerie magic symbol scribbled on the storehouse shutter had eloquently indicated the location of the hidden corpses. I mean, putting the key there also delayed them by a short amount of time, so if it was to both delay and force them to find the bodies, it's worked. Sure, it doesn't explicitly mention the corpses, but 6 people had gone missing. But the situation somehow had made such an obvious piece of graffiti and even returned the key to the shutter. Like, okay, so clearly they wanted the body to be found because they mutilated the corpses, which is pointless unless you want the corpses to be found. Or to hide them better. But they weren't hiding them at all by mutilating them, although they wanted the corpses here to be discovered. They still haven't factored in any sort of secret entrances, such as a window like that, like the one in the top left corner, but bigger.
犯人の手からもこの場所を保護する意味で施錠を新たにしたいと言っているのです。
A lot of movement going on outside.
私も賛成です。
Genji fished around inside the storehouse and unsealed a brand new padlock that had been inside a small box.
鍵はどうなさいますか？
私が持ちましょう。責任を持って警察に手渡します。
Netsui took the key to the padlock from Genji's hand. After that, they all exited and lowered the shutter, and so the corpses once again sealed behind that shutter, which was still covered by that creepy magic circle. Genji crouched in front of the shutter and fastened a new padlock. Shutters often have a place in front where you can attach your own lock, in addition to the main lock of the shutter. This was one of those types. In the midst of the roar of thunder of the pounding rain, the storehouse stood there ominously. When it closed, the shutter, covered in blood-like creepy substance, it surrounded the bodies of the six. To that theory, putting a new lock on wasn't mainly to preserve the scene for the police. She might have felt like she wanted to shut that mouth for all eternity, to prevent that eerie beast from swallowing up any more victims.
さあ行きましょう。皆さん、南條先生、ご足労をありがとうございました。現時は急いで警察に連絡を。
戻りましたらすぐに連絡します。
The adults left the storehouse. The ghastly magic circle drawn on the shutter kept the six bodies in its throat, looming eerily as the lightning occasionally lit it up.